I have a faith in the process if you're honest and curious. And to me, if you're honest and curious, you will find your way to the truth.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back, everyone, for episode 31. My guest today is the National Organizing Manager at the Secular Student Alliance. After nearly 20 years in congregational pastoral ministry in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in 2014 he had a very public deconversion that he wrote about at the Year Without God blog. Since that time, he's been a writer and speaker on the subjects of religion, humanism, and justice. In 2015, he founded the Life After God community and podcast. You can find out more about the Life After God by going to lifeaftergod.org. And if you'd like information about the Secular Student Alliance, secularstudents.org is their website. I first heard part of his story when I heard about the Year Without God. A short time later, I discovered his podcast, Life After God. Hearing the stories of the people he interviewed, or just hearing the people that he was interviewing about the subject of deconversion or atheism, has been such a big encouragement to me. So I personally want to thank Ryan for creating the Life After God community and the podcast, and for all the work that he's done to encourage those of us who have deconverted from Christianity. I also want to thank the others that are involved in the Life After God community, and for helping get the word out about my podcast when Voices of Deconversion first started. I've heard a lot about Ryan's story, not just from listening to his podcast, but from hearing him on other podcasts. But in our interview today, it was really fun to hear some of the details that I haven't heard before. Everything from getting baptized when he was 10 years old, to the time that he spent in Nicaragua around the time that he was starting the Year Without God blog. Finally, it was really cool to hear the story about how the Year Without God blog blew up overnight. He ends up having all sorts of media contact him, and in a few weeks he's having breakfast with Penn Jillette. He has a fascinating and compelling story. It was really wonderful to finally meet him. Here's my conversation with Ryan Bell. All right, well, Ryan, thanks for joining me. I've been looking forward to speaking with you for a while, so thanks for making the time to join me today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
For people who may not know your story, you're out there a lot with the Life After God stuff, and you've kind of been out in the public eye for a little while, starting with the Year Without God and all of that. But for folks who may not be familiar with your story, I'd like to just talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into the Secular Student Alliance and what you're doing these days. So,
sure. I
guess start with kind of the early years. Like, how did Christianity kind of influence your childhood as you were growing up?
Well, I was always there. So, at some point around age 4 or 5, people start having memories of their life. And my earliest memories of my family life include going to church. We were United Methodists at the time. And I don't have a memory of us being like ultra religious. It was more like going to church most Sundays, going to Sunday school, doing crafts, hearing stories. And that was pretty much the extent of my religious background. It was later on, as my parents were going through some struggles in their marriage, that my folks moved. We all moved from Ohio to California and lived with my grandparents for a time. And my grandparents are Seventh-day Adventists, and my grandmother's still living. My grandfather passed away about 12 years ago, but they were really, at that time in their life, very earnest, strong Seventh-day Adventists. And in the process of them assisting my folks with their marriage, which ended up ending anyway, we started going to church with them. And my parents joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it was a pretty seamless transition for me. It all just seemed pretty much like church. I didn't really sense much difference. But growing up, the Seventh-day Adventist experience was my baseline, and it was a positive thing for the most part. It included, vacation Bible school, Sabbath school in this case, because we started going to church on Saturday, and summer camp at the Adventist summer camp. Eventually went to an Adventist elementary school. So it was pretty immersive, but all in all, it was a positive experience. I think the most negative thing I can recall from my childhood was that as Seventh-day Adventists, they don't engage in normal sort of secular activities on the Sabbath. So it was Saturday from Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown. We didn't watch TV. We didn't play sports. We didn't play video games or pretty much even listen to secular music or read secular books. It was pretty much spiritual 24 hours, including church, and then up until sundown. And as a result, you have this kind of experience as a child where you're kind of looking forward to sundown on Saturday night so that you can go out to the movies or hang out with your friends or talk on the phone to your girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. So, that was definitely my childhood experience. It was more or less pretty positive. I felt I've sort of described, I don't know if in public and something I'm writing, sort of being held by it. It got more, traumatic later in life, but even at that point, with the divorce and the move and everything, and then with the introduction of a stepfather who was pretty awful to my brother and me, I really felt like my faith really kind of held me, kept me safe. It was a place to turn to. Sometimes atheists kind of mockingly refer to Jesus as your invisible friend. And quite frankly, he was very much like an invisible friend who never rejected me. I mean, one thing about a God who never answers you back is that he never answers you back aggressively or meanly either.
Right.
Like a good therapist who doesn't say much and just listens.
He essentially can be whatever you want him to be. And that's very much how Christians, experience God, is however close they want him, whatever they need him to be. It seems like that's what he becomes. So how old were you when this move happened, and then when the stepfather kind of came into the mix?
I suppose I was about 6 when the move happened, and then probably around 9 when my stepfather came into the picture. In my 9th year, I went to summer camp and gave my heart to Jesus. It was a very emotional, very positive, emotional experience. And when I came back home, I turned 10 that fall and was baptized a month or 2 later in November. So it was the Thanksgiving weekend, actually. It was the Saturday closest to Thanksgiving, whatever that was in 1981.
Wow, that's crazy. Mine was March 10th, and every March 10th I think about it. I may not say anything to my wife or anything, but I'm always thinking like, wow, it's been this many years,
Yeah, it's like a birthday, it's like you're born again, so it's like your second birthday.
Well, and it's a significant time in your life, like especially for you. You were pretty young then too.
I was, and not everyone in the Adventist church gets baptized that young. It's probably more likely 13, 14. Yeah. But I was really an earnest kid, I would say. I was pretty spiritual, philosophical minded. Not that I understood anything about philosophy, but all the big existential questions hit me pretty young in my life, pretty early.
Do you think that's what led you into the ministry eventually?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've often said that if I wasn't raised in a religious household, I might have majored in philosophy in college. But given that I was, a religious child, the corollary to philosophy is theology. And it's where you seek the answers, to life's big questions. And it was definitely that sort of thoughtful, inward, kind of reflective disposition that I had. And a kind of I don't know how else to describe it than to say like a spiritual turn, in my life, that I really wanted to please God. I wanted to be good. I didn't get into trouble. Yeah, I just was a spiritual kid, and it was just sort of natural. Although I didn't go straight into the ministry. In high school, I went to a public high school and did well in both the humanities and in the sciences. And so when I went to college, I had started off in the sciences, then moved into the humanities. And it was only after some bouncing around between majors that I eventually, found my place in ministry.
And which college did you go to?
Nothing that anybody will recognize.
Was it a Seventh-day Adventist college? Or?
Yeah, both of them were Seventh-day Adventist colleges. The first one was Pacific Union College, which is more of a Christian-influenced, Christian Seventh-day Adventist liberal arts college, and then ended up transferring to Weimar College, which I think is still operating, but it's a very basic, unaccredited Bible college
Yeah.
in the mountains outside of Sacramento. So
Oh, wow.
it was, yeah, pretty off the radar and not a very good education, I would say.
I didn't really know anyone who was Seventh-day Adventist growing up, and I've heard a little bit I've had guests that were, but, and I've heard some of your interviews, and, but would you consider it a more like an evangelical denomination or not?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, sort of in character and disposition, it's evangelical. I think, the Adventist Church has had a rocky relationship with the evangelical mainstream just because they do have this Seventh-day Sabbath and some other unique doctrines that have put Adventists sort of at odds with the mainstream of the evangelical movement. I often said when I was a younger pastor that I was too conservative for the liberal mainline denominations and too, I want to say liberal, but like weird for the conservative, fundamentalists.
Yeah, it was just different. It wasn't necessarily more liberal. It was just different.
Yeah, the fundamentalists and the mainstream evangelicals thought I was a cult because I had these other weird things, like almost like Jehovah's Witnesses or something.
Right.
And the Episcopalians and the Lutherans and the Methodists thought I was just a fundamentalist evangelical. So it was kind of stuck in the middle.
They just kind of lump a lot of conservatives all into one bucket sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to a Lutheran college, so I kind of learned. I had no idea about any of this denomination differences stuff until I was going to a Lutheran college, and people are referring to fundamentalists, and I'm like, what's a fundamentalist? I'm like, oh, I'm a fundamentalist, I guess.
That's me.
Like, oh, that's how you pejoratively refer to us. Okay.
I'm standing right here.
Yeah, I'm here. I can hear you. Yeah. Well, did you feel like then, it sounded like your relationship with God, a lot of evangelicals refer to like a personal relationship with God. It sounds like it was pretty personal for you. Is that true?
Yeah, I think especially in the beginning, it was very personal. I have, very distinct memories, even in college, of, taking a walk in the morning. And sometimes I'd get up even before the sun was up and go for a walk and pray as I walked.
Yeah.
And I had that distinct feeling like God was just walking with me, or Jesus, or however you want to describe it. But that God in some form was walking with me and was, looking after me and part of my regular conversational life.
Yeah. Well, when did things get serious with your faith? And it sounds like in college is when you started thinking about ministry. Is that probably the first time, or was it before that?
Yeah, that's true. It was probably in college. I mean, I actually gave a few sermons. In high school, I gave some sermons that were well received, as far as a 16-year-old goes. And I thought at that time, people said, oh, you'd be a great pastor. And I just didn't want to be a pastor. I thought the pastors that we had were sort of boring people and not that interesting. And I had other interests and that kind of thing. But it was in college that I feel like other people's interest in me being a pastor sort of caught up with me.
Yeah.
And I started to see it in a different light, that maybe I could serve a good purpose in doing that. And I also had a sort of almost a more fundamentalist turn in college. I reached my most conservative, my most fundamentalist in my first 2 years of college. And I really didn't, the thing I did before I started pastoral ministry was history and pre-med. And then I thought, wow, I'm going to be in medical school for 8 years and then in residency, and Jesus is going to come, before that. And I don't want to be in medical school when Jesus comes. I need to be out saving souls and, doing the Lord's work. So I really stopped my pre-med coursework and went into ministry on basically that feeling.
Wow. That's a big deal. Yeah. I remember the urgency as a conservative, the evangelical, the urgency of he could come back at any moment. That's how I was raised as well. And it can kind of freak you out. Like, I better get going because, at any moment he comes back, and then my life, I haven't finished the things I want to do,
And soon is such a vague thing. Like, what is soon? It could be, 100 years. It could be tomorrow. It's just such a slippery word for Christians.
Exactly.
And you never know.
Yeah. Well, fast forward to, you've been in the ministry, I believe 20 years. Is that right?
Yeah, counting graduate school, the 2 years that I was in seminary, I wasn't in full-time ministry, but I was doing part-time ministry while I went to do my master's degree. So counting all of that, it was 19.
So fast forward to that time, and I first became aware of you when you started doing, Christian pastor. Yeah, I saw it on like CNN or something. Christian pastor says that he wants to, do a year without God. And I heard Cass mention this too, way back in the day on an interview did with Everyone's Agnostic, that he thought it was like a gimmick or something. And that's kind of how I thought too. I was an atheist at the time, and I'm like, what's this? Like, like it's just going to try it out and be like, oh yeah, it's not true. That's kind of what I thought was going on. But it wasn't.
And a lot of other people. Yeah, a lot of people thought that.
Yeah, but I've heard you talk about it, and it was a sincere thing. And you were a lot closer to atheism at that point than I think maybe it seemed to people.
Yeah, or maybe even seemed to me. The way I ended up describing it was at that point, because sometimes you can't really adequately assess where you're at when you're there. It kind of takes some distance to look back and kind of evaluate where you're at. I mean, at the moment, I thought, I'm a Christian sort of flirting with atheism, but I really wanted God to be real. So my motivation was to sort of find my way. Actually, my motivation really was to know what was true. But all things being equal, I would have preferred for my faith to be true because it's connected to everything in my life, as you understand, and so many people that are listening who have been deeply embedded in religious life and faith understand that your family and your children, if you have children, and your career, and very often your entire friend circle and everything is tied up in it. So if I had to make 3 wishes to a genie or something, I would have wished for God to be real. Even if it wasn't in the sort of traditional Christian way, I was fine with that. In fact, I was already kind of to that point where I didn't think any real Christian denomination or group had any lock on what God is about. But I kind of wanted there to be this metaphysical reality that I could continue to count on. And so I decided to take a year and really explore what it means to be an atheist, to talk to atheists, find out what atheists felt about the world, what they did believe and what they didn't believe. I mean, I remember the first week or so, being schooled, as you can only imagine, by atheists on my blog about what atheism is. Everybody loves to, make sure everybody's defining the terms right. Atheism is just this very simple answer to a relatively basic question, which is, does God exist? Yes or no? So, okay, I clarified that. That's that question. But there are other questions. That's not the only question that's important in the world. And that's kind of the learning curve that I went on. And part of it was intellectual. Part of it was almost journalistic, talking to people. I went to the American Atheist Convention that year in Salt Lake City and met a bunch of people, including Dave Silverman and, David Smalley and a bunch of the, I think Matt Dillahunty was there. So I met a lot of these people who, I was very fortunate in the sense that my blog had gone viral at that point, and so people were very open and willing to talk to me. So I had an access that I think the average questioning Christian might not have had.
Yeah.
But they were very kind and supportive and firm in what they thought about the world. But so part of it was, an intellectual process for me. Part of it was journalistic, kind of almost anthropological, like learning from other people, trying to figure out what this subculture is about. And then part of it was spiritual for me. Part of it was sort of inward and like what's going on in my soul, I would have said, or my heart, or my my thoughts, or my inward life. The idea that there's no God means that when I feel desperate or panicky or anxiety ridden or whatever, that it's just me and my friends. There's no outside higher power. So that's an existential, emotional thing. So all of these things were happening simultaneously. And so the whole year was a mix of all of those things, plus the writing.
Is there anything you can think about just before all this started to happen in your life that led to those doubts or those doubts, maybe specifically the doubts that started to creep in that kind of led you down this path?
Yeah, I mean, they had been gradually growing over time. And my church was pretty unique in that I had lots of different types of people there, including some people that were atheists, and one guy was a Buddhist who didn't believe in God. A lot of Buddhists are atheists.
Yeah.
So I was trying to account for all of that. I was very involved in interfaith work at the time. And when when you take interfaith work seriously and pluralism, then, it relativizes all of your claims about your own faith. So, Christianity taken, I think, relatively seriously in the mainstream sort of, and again, not to make it too fundamentalist version, because I don't want to critique a fringe version of Christianity and then have people just say, oh, well, that's that fringe version of Christianity. Right. The mainstream part of Christianity is that, Jesus is the way to salvation and really the only way. And there are some workarounds, for certain progressive branches of Christianity, but by and large, Jesus is essential to the process in some shape or form. And when you start entering into dialogue with Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists, there are not only other pathways, but also other objectives. For a lot of world religions, the idea of being saved doesn't even make sense. That's not the question that their religion is trying to answer.
Interesting.
So even the questions aren't the same. And so you start really, that sends you down a path of oh my gosh, so how do I know that mine's the right one? Or is there can you even speak of a right one in any kind of serious way? So I was going through all of that and saying, okay, well, maybe if Christianity isn't the absolute truth, it's a truth. It's one of many truths. I can live with that, right? So I'm just relativizing my stuff, my beliefs, my faith, my theology. At the same time, Proposition 8 came along in California in 2008, which was the state legislation, the state ballot initiative, which proposed a constitutional amendment to outlaw same-sex marriage, which passed. Yeah. And it was driven, of course, largely by people of faith, and my denomination supported Proposition 8. I and my congregation stood up against Proposition 8 and nearly ended my career at that point. But somehow I survived that little skirmish. But it was like a fatal wound. Fast forward 2 or 3 years, by the time we get to 2013, my relationship with the denomination is on such a thin thread that I basically forced the question and said to our denominational president, can you affirm my ministry or not? I can't be, I just, emotionally, I was starting to have some real issues in my life, even physically, medically, and the tension was too much. And I just wanted to know yes or no, am I legitimate here or not? And in the end, fast forwarding through all that, I wasn't.
When you asked them that question, did you consider yourself a Christian at that point?
I did, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so even up to that point, but you were just so maybe radical in some people's minds, or in the denomination's minds, you were kind of radical or not orthodox.
Right. I mean, a Christian is certainly on the very, very outer fringe of Adventism. So I think if you had said, "Are you really an Adventist anymore?" I would have had some serious doubts about that. If when you say, "Were you a Christian?" Yes, I definitely felt Christian at that point.
So this takes away your livelihood, and were the physical ailments you were experiencing in relation to the process of losing faith, or were they just separate?
Indirectly, maybe. I mean, I think it had more to do with the tension between me and the denomination. Just being called in before disciplinary committees, over and over again, being threatened with my livelihood.
Wow.
And it wasn't super major stuff. I experienced a panic attack, which sent me to the hospital thinking I was having a heart attack, which is a, pretty scary thing.
Yeah.
And developed acid reflux, so just nothing super, super deadly or anything, but definitely my body was reflecting outwardly what I was experiencing inwardly. And it was just, I had to make some changes.
Yeah. And at the time, you were married with a young child, right?
2 kids. They were preteens around that time. One was just sort of moving into the teenage years.
Okay,
2
so
girls.
This is all at stake when you lose your job. So
sure.
What was next? What came next then when you lost your job? And
yeah, I left the country for 6 weeks just to kind of get some space and clear my head and try to not think about all of these things for a little while. I felt like while I had lost a lot of things, I also gained a little bit of freedom and peace of mind. And I thought, if I don't, take advantage of this, I'll be into another career pretty soon and I won't have this space. So I went to Nicaragua for 6 weeks and studied Spanish.
Oh, cool.
And just, relaxed. So
well,
it was
much
great.
needed relaxation, it sounds like.
Yeah. And then when I came back, I started thinking about church again. What do I do? And there were people urging me to plant my own church, plant a new church that was very different than anything that was really available at the time.
And you're still thinking yourself a Christian at that point?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and it's a progressive process, as we all know. But I'm just curious kind of where you're at as you're going through these stages. So, okay. So you get back, yeah.
Yeah, I think at that stage, I was pretty clear that I went back to the Seventh-day Adventist church that I used to pastor, and that only took about 2 weeks of that before I realized I couldn't do that because people were still referring to me as the pastor. They kept asking me questions about what was coming next, and I was like, I don't know, and they would say, hey, good morning, pastor, and I'm like, I can't, it's too much.
Yeah. It's
not workable, and it's not fair to them for me to just be there and like put them through that. But earlier I had made this pledge, like, this is my community. No matter what anyone else says, this is my community. And it was sort of a hard move for me to admit, like, I don't really belong here anymore. So I went to another also very progressive Adventist church and just didn't fit in there. And I went to another evangelical church and didn't really feel like I fit in there. And went to a bunch of other, progressive churches, a Catholic church, Episcopal church here locally. And in each case, I just felt a kind of misfit. I felt like I was trying too hard. I was force fitting myself into something that I didn't feel comfortable to me.
Yeah.
Not that everything should feel comfortable all the time, but I had been through a long period of time where a lot of things were uncomfortable, and I needed to figure out what was good for me. And I had really put my own needs and my own health and my own, mental sanity and all of that on the line. And I needed to take care of myself. So I said, well, I'm just not going to be involved in church.
Okay.
And I just started going to a museum on Saturday mornings when I would normally, or Sunday mornings, whichever day, when I would normally have tried to go to church, and started reading philosophy and doing other things that I enjoy. And had always, been intrigued by, Marx's critique of religion, Nietzsche's critique of religion, and had always just sort of backburnered those things. Some other contemporary philosophers' critique of religion, as well as contemporary philosophers who still find some value in religion. And so that, I still, and even to this very day, I'm still fascinated by the subject of religion and how it works in our society and societies around the world, and what role it plays, and to what degree it's destructive or not. So all that stuff's still very interesting to me, and it was at the time. And I picked up this little book called Religion for Atheists, and I thought, well, that sounds perfect, because I thought I feel more religious than spiritual. I always have. I always felt, well, not always, because I remember I said that I had this deeply spiritual experience as a young adult. But the older I got and the more doubts crept in about, the veracity of things that I was taught to believe, like the age of the earth and the reprehensible nature of gay people, all these things. I'm like, no, I don't believe that. I don't believe that.
Yeah.
So the fewer beliefs I had, the more I turned my faith more towards social justice and activism and, putting my values into action in the world. And so I was really interested in the way religion works to bind together a group of people and enable them to be mobilized into some type of positive action in the world, which and sort of downplays the spiritual side. So I thought, religion for atheists, I never even heard of such a thing. So I thought, well, maybe there's something there, and even at that time, I thought maybe I could have an atheist church, or at least an agnostic church, a church where you could believe in God or not, but it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because, life after God is essentially that,
Yeah.
It's the space between belief and non-belief, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it ended up being kind of that thing.
And I picked up that book late in December and had lunch with a friend of mine, and he said, what are you reading? And we talked a little bit about it. And I said, I've been thinking I might, it was New Year's resolutions were on my mind. Not that I ever put a ton of stock into that, but I had all this time. Like, I was unemployed. I wasn't going to church. I was trying to figure my life out, trying to figure me out. Here I am, 40 something, early 40s, trying to figure out the direction of my life. And it's the first of the year coming around. So I'm like, I got to make this year count. What am I going to do? And I had two projects on my mind. One was to go back to El Paso, where I had spent a little bit of time doing some research about immigration. And I thought I had a friend there who I could stay with. And I thought, I'm just going to, try to learn to become a reporter, because I've always wanted to be a journalist. And I thought if I just go to El Paso and I just start writing stories about what I see along the border, and maybe it sticks, maybe it doesn't, but I don't have the credentials to be a journalist. So the only way to really become a journalist is to do it and see if it takes and see if anybody gives me a chance or whatever.
Yeah.
The other idea that came into my mind was to write a blog about atheism and about like a Christian's journey into atheism, or a Christian's sort of exploration of atheism. And because that was the more pressing existential concern, my friend was like, you got to do that. And I'm like, really? I don't know. Will anybody read it? And he was like, well, I'll read it and I'll tell my friends to read it. And I was like,
cool.
All right. So I just went home and went on, GoDaddy or whatever and searched for a URL. And I had a couple of different ideas in mind and ended up going with Year Without God. And I had a Huffington Post blog at the time. And I suppose I still do. I just don't write for them anymore. But so I cross-posted it there, figuring that would, you open a blog and nobody knows it's there. It's just,
Right.
The universe is so big. So how do I get people to at least know it's there? So I said, well, I'll cross-post it there, put a link and see what happens, and went to bed and woke up the next morning to just a deluge of interest.
Oh my God, that's so funny.
It was insane.
That's nuts.
Hemant Mehta had picked it up and posted about it on Friendly Atheist. And within 2 days, CNN had called.
That's nuts.
The BBC was calling, PBS, a couple of different NPR stations.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, what the hell is happening? I had no idea.
I'm just imagining you like making yourself breakfast the next morning and like buttering your toast, and you look at your phone and like, what?
Yeah. Well, I had started a Facebook page, Year Without God, and I had started a Twitter account, Year Without God. And I had the volume turned up on my phone that morning when I woke up, and it was just like literally like bing, 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 bing. And I had like 1,200 Twitter followers by the end of the day.
That's crazy.
It was insane. Yeah, it was really crazy. So that kind of, obviously that affects the whole thing, but it did definitely open a lot of doors. Within like 3 weeks, I was at Penn Jillette's house in his studio recording his podcast. It was just like,
holy smokes.
I didn't even know who Penn Jillette was. I swear to God, I had never heard the name before. And I'm like,
so
sure.
funny.
Like, my friend Emery was like, I want you to go to Vegas and sit down and talk to Penn Jillette. And I'm like, who's Penn Jillette? He's like, he's a magician. And, yeah. He's got TV shows. He's done all this stuff. He's done movies. Has a magic show on the Strip. And I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. So I go there. I had breakfast with him and one of his friends, and afterwards I Google him, and I was like, oh shit, this guy's a big deal.
Like legit, like he's on TV every week now. Yeah,
so it's just kind of one of those weird, like, dumped in the deep end, of all of this.
That's really funny. Well, at what point along this journey did you realize, I'm done, I'm not a Christian anymore?
I think I had a pretty good idea about halfway through Year Without God. About June or July, all the arguments made sense to me for why God doesn't exist, or at least why you can't demonstrate that he does. But then I thought, well, I've committed this for a year. How should I spend this last 5 or 6 months? So, not in an exhaustive way, but I decided, okay, I'm going to go back and read some of the Christian counter arguments now. I'm not going to bother with, William Lane Craig, because he's just a jerk. But there are some, Christian apologists who are nice people and sincere believers in what they do. I mean, there's a part of me that feels like some apologists are a little bit dishonest at some level. Like, it's almost hard to be a good apologist without being a little bit dishonest.
Yeah.
Almost about anything. Like, if you were an apologist for the United States of America, for example, like, take religion out of it completely. Like, you have to be a little dishonest.
You find a way to defend what you're defending. It's almost,
Yeah, like, how are you going to be the president of the United States, for example, and not be a little bit dishonest or a lot dishonest about what goes on, So,
right.
Anyway, but there are some that are more honest than others, and I encountered a few of those and really well, let me give them a shot, like to like explain this to me in a different way. So I spent a good part of the last half of the year doing that. And then by the end of the year, I was very comfortable saying, I'm a humanist first and sort of by default an atheist as well.
Would you still refer to yourself that way?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't mind saying I'm an atheist. I don't have any sort of qualms about it. I don't feel anxious about it at all. But it also doesn't tell you very much about me. So I don't go around proclaiming that I'm an atheist very often unless it comes up or people ask me what I believe. And I just said, I don't believe in anything supernatural. And I'll say I'm an atheist and people, what do you mean by that? And I'm like, well, I just don't believe in anything supernatural. I just think that the natural world and everything that we see, at least to the best of our knowledge, is the only thing that there is.
Yeah.
And if there's more, then we'll find out. But for now, it seems like that's pretty much what we've got. Unless you know something I don't know, so that's, I just feel really comfortable about that. But it doesn't tell you much about me to know that I don't believe in God.
Right.
So what's more important to me is what I do believe and what I do care about. And that's for me partially expressed in humanism. Partially expressed in my, my political beliefs and that type of thing.
Well, and we'll get into very soon here the Secular Student Alliance, because I think that kind of segues pretty nicely into what you are for and what you stand for in life and what you believe in. Because I think it's just in what I know about the Secular Student Alliance, it's a politically active organization. So, but before we jump into that, just a few reflections on your experience as a whole. When you think back now at the Christian Ryan Bell, what do you think about that person now?
That's a great question, a nice way of putting it. I think he was doing the best he could and was fairly honest all the way along. I didn't do a very good job of pretending to believe things I didn't believe. And because I had the luxury of being the pastor of the church, when I found something I wasn't comfortable with, I could just leave it out.
Yeah.
I didn't have to say things I didn't believe in. I just didn't talk about them at all. So I didn't go around preaching that the earth was 6,000 years old. I just didn't talk about the age of the earth.
Yeah, just avoid it.
So, yeah. So as a result, there could be people in my church that believed the earth was 6,000 years old, and they didn't know that I didn't believe that and didn't care. I did give one sermon about Genesis 1, and but even that, was sort of left to the listener to kind of piece things together. I just basically said Genesis wasn't about origins in the way that we think about origins today. It's just not.
Yeah.
So, in fact, using Genesis 1, even for evolutionary, I don't know, it's not even a good counter argument. It's just Genesis 1 isn't about the origin of the earth. It looks like it is, but it's really not.
So what's something you've experienced since deconverting that you may not have if you were still Christian?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is less shame. I think I still, we're human. I'm human. So old wounds don't just go away. There's still scars in some cases, but I think, fundamental to Christianity, and any Christian that tells me this isn't true, this is something I'll really stick to. Fundamental to Christianity, basic to Christianity of any stripe or variety, is that we are not okay as people without Jesus. That we are fundamentally flawed and broken and lost and irredeemable and unlovable, and that God does this remarkable thing and loves us anyway, which is against his nature. He'd really rather just smite us, but Jesus steps in the way and says, no, I will stand in their place, and God gets his pound of flesh and we get off the hook. So, and you can tell that story a variety of different ways, but that's essentially the heart of the gospel, which is, a Greek word for good news. And I really quickly, by March or April of my year without God, I was like, oh my God, this is so screwed up.
Yeah.
It's no wonder that people are dealing with, issues of shame and guilt, and some denominations lay on the guilt more than others, but we all get some of that. And I feel like I've been able to forgive myself easier. I've been able to make mistakes and bounce back from them. As a result, I think also being a little bit more generous with others, knowing that they're also kind of flawed people.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. What are you most proud of when you think about your transition?
Like, I'm proud of the fact that I was able to stay relatively in the middle as I wanted to do. I really wanted to be in that sort of liminal space, neither this nor that. And some of that might seem to people like a little bit of gamesmanship or playing around. But for me, it was an intentional kind of staying in the discomfort of it. And I don't think, it's probably not healthy for our minds to live in constant discomfort for a long period of time.
Right.
But occasionally it's good to have a little cognitive dissonance. It's good to say, gosh, my political beliefs have always been this, but there's this new piece of evidence. I don't know what to do with that. And I'm not prepared to make a snap judgment about it. I have to live in this tension about, I have these beliefs, but there's this evidence. I have these beliefs, but there's this evidence. And to say, and I think the temptation is to resolve it quickly so that tension, that feeling goes away. And we're like, oh, okay, I feel better now.
Or not think about it, yeah.
Yeah, or just not think of it. And so I think a lot of people say, well, there's people that are smarter than me who are Christians, and so I'll just leave it to them and I'll just be a Christian. Or they might say, these Christians are such awful, horrible people, I'm going to be an atheist and just switch over. I'm not saying there's anything wrong fundamentally with doing that, but I really wanted to stay in that tension of not knowing, and even when I felt like I learned something and I did know something new, there was plenty more that I didn't know, and to kind of sort of keep moving through things that I wasn't sure about and be able to settle on some things that maybe, even Stephen Hawking's not sure about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's things that some of the smartest people in the world don't know, and that's okay. And to not default to certainty as a kind of comfort zone and to live in that discomfort a little bit. I feel good about that. I feel good about giving the whole year to that experience.
Yeah, because it takes an amount of courage to be able to do that, to be able to go out of your comfort zone and kind of lean in to those difficult things,
Yeah, and it's funny because I think anytime someone's courageous, they don't feel like they're being courageous at that time. If you feel like you're doing the only thing you can do, all the structures of my life had kind of been knocked out from under me, and so I was like, well, what else am I going to do? So I can see how other people would see it as courageous, but I really just felt like I was doing the thing I had to do to stay alive and not go crazy.
Well, I mean, I went through something sort of similar because I went through deconversion, and there's lots of people that did, and I view it all as courageous. I mean, I think it's...
I agree.
You made me think of an FDR quote, and it's he says, courage is not the absence of fear, rather it is the assessment that something is more important than fear. And
oh, that's good.
Yeah, and I love that, and I think in your case it was like the truth was more important to you. I think this is true of many deconverts, but
yeah, I think a lot of people come to that place, and it is about comfort and discomfort in many cases. And I often said that I came to the place where I would rather have an uncomfortable truth than a comforting lie. And not everybody feels that way. I think some people are very happy to say, there may not be a God, and the Bible may not be exactly the way it looks, but this makes me happy, and my family is comfortable here. And for them, they're not doing any harm to anyone else, it seems to me, and that's where they feel comfortable. I just couldn't stay in that place. It wasn't for me.
Yeah. What about you? I think about your childhood and being very religious and just being, it sounds like you were a good boy, you were a good student, you were a good Christian, growing up. And then you go into the ministry and spend 20 years pretty much, and then deconvert, and now you consider yourself an atheist and a humanist. But in that huge transition, there's always things about us that stay the same, that are good, positive things. What thread carried through all that time in your life that you would look to and say, this is something that's always been true of me?
Yeah, I think the what's wonderful about that question, and it's something that the memoir that I'm ridiculously still working on, the sort of the through line of that story, of that book, is really about what stayed the same. As a result, I've thought a little bit about it, and I think the lion's share of things stay the same. I mean, I think faith is enmeshed in different people's lives to different degrees.
Yeah.
But even so, we are people with many commitments and many passions. And so for me, it was, I think, compassion, the desire to do what's right, whatever that is, and struggling like everyone does to know what that is.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, to make the world a safer and more equitable place for more people. That's always been something that I've been concerned about. My political commitments, my interest in equality, my interest in opportunity, equal opportunity, and sort of anti-poverty efforts, and resistance to capitalism writ large. I feel like those are things that have stayed the same for me.
Yeah.
And also an interest in people's, the arc of people's stories. I'm really interested in how people change and evolve. And a person who was very influential in my development, who I only had the privilege of interacting with through his books, is M. Scott Peck. And his book, A Different Drum, was really influential to me, and it helped me understand that people go through phases of what he would have said like faith development, but I think it's more just like human development, psychological development, and we don't often skip phases. Like we don't go from being a 5-year-old to being a 40-year-old. Like we first become 6, and then we become 7, and then we become 8. And there are no shortcuts in that process. And I work with people that are older than me and younger than me. My friends are both older than me and younger than me. And when you reach middle age, you kind of notice the differences in a more stark way. Like people who are in their 20s are concerned about different things because they're in a different phase of their life.
Yeah.
People that are in their 30s have anxieties that they didn't have when they were 20, but are also different than the anxieties that I have in my 40s. So people are just going through these stages. And I think the same is true of our spiritual development, if I can use that word, our sort of psychosocial development.
Yeah.
And I think a sense of compassion for people and understanding that they are where they are for a whole host of reasons, and not necessarily feeling the urge to like jerk them into the place that I'm in, but rather to help them answer the question that they're asking right now, whatever that's at. Because there was a time when I wasn't where I'm at, and I asked lots of intermediary questions before I got to the big question. You know what I mean? So, and some people do that quickly, and some people take a life. I took forever to do it. It took me 20, 30 years to go through this whole thing to where I'm at today.
For someone who's in the deconversion process, who's just leaving Christianity now, what's something you could say to them that, a piece of guidance or some encouragement for that person who's going through that, who's listening?
Yeah, I always say, like, don't feel in a rush. I know it's tough to live in that discomfort of the in-between, but there's no rush. There's no, like, it's not a timed exam, where the bell's going to go off and you haven't finished all the questions. It's about being true to yourself and knowing what question is really on your mind that you want to answer, and not being afraid of that question. Not being afraid to address that issue that you're really concerned about. So maybe it's whether the Bible is truly the inspired word of God. You're nowhere near yet thinking about like whether God is real or not. Like you're just frustrated about the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, deal with that. Like dig into some scholarship about where did the Bible come from, who wrote it, how long ago, how well do we know for sure who wrote it and not, and that question will lead you. See, this is the thing. I have a faith in the process. If you're honest and curious, and to me, if you're honest and curious, you will find your way to the truth. I don't need to rush you or drag you or kick you or my role is simply, if I have a role at all, is to just simply be an encourager and just to say that's a great question. I think you should spend some time figuring the answer to that to your satisfaction.
That's cool.
And I think that question will naturally lead to the next one and the next one, and eventually people will end up somewhere, and they may not end up where I end up, but that's also okay.
Yeah, no, that's good. So let's go ahead and jump into Secular Student Alliance. So for those who don't know about it, how did it start? What's it about?
Yeah, it's a 17-year-old organization, believe it or not. It's been around quite a while, started by a gentleman named August Brunsman, who was a student at Ohio State University, and just felt a need for a student club on campus for secular students. And I don't know the intimate details of how it developed, but my understanding is that as he did that, other students from around thought, gosh, that'd be cool if we had one too. And it grew naturally from there to the point now where we have over 200 chapters in colleges and universities and a few high schools all over the country.
That's great.
Including some international. There's not a big engine driving the international thing, but if we have some international students who want to affiliate, we give them whatever resources that we can.
Yeah.
From a distance.
So it's 200 total chapters, and that includes college, high school, and international altogether.
Yeah, everything.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're basically autonomous clubs that have the freedom to elect their officers, choose their activities. We give them some guidance and instruction about kind of some pointers on how to start and maintain and grow a group. We have some key calendar dates that we sort of encourage as many of our groups to participate in if they can. But for the most part, each group does what they feel compelled to do, what they feel like doing.
Okay.
Some are more focused on asserting their identity, because a lot of our clubs are in the South and in the Midwest, and even in the Mid-Atlantic region where being an atheist is still a huge gasp. People have never met an actual living, breathing atheist.
Right.
And if they have, they're afraid that they're going to get, contaminated or something. So sometimes our groups are doing a lot just to stand out in the quad and say, I'm an atheist, ask me anything. In other places, it's kind of old hat that people are atheists. At USC here in Los Angeles, for example, over 40% of incoming freshmen are unaffiliated. Doesn't mean they're atheists necessarily, but they're unaffiliated with any religion.
Interesting.
So the needs of that campus are pretty different. And as a result, the club there is pretty different.
Yeah.
They sort of take their atheism for granted in a way and then move on to other things that they're interested in that grow out of their secular worldview.
Oh, cool. And so it takes the flavor of the student group that is leading it.
It really does. And the geography and the needs, the political climate, whatever.
So what drew you to work for the Secular Student Alliance?
It's I've always been an admirer and never really had the right opportunity to get involved for whatever reason. I had done some work on campuses, but not with Secular Student Alliance. I had been a speaker in a few places and actually did speak for a couple of SSA chapters, one in Atlanta. I can't remember if there was another one, but there's been a lot of change, and there was the office moved to Los Angeles from Columbus recently, and Bart Campolo, my friend Bart, knew that they were looking for some new organizer, and I just reached out to the new executive director and sent in my resume, and it just fell together. So
that's awesome. Yeah,
it was just really good timing. Really, fortunate for me in a way too that it's right here in Los Angeles. I didn't have to go anywhere.
Oh, seriously, yeah.
And it gives me, it's really in some ways really ideal for me because it takes some of my leadership and organizing background from religion and applies it in a secular context.
Perfect. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, there's more that's the same about that than that's different. It's students have similar needs and concerns, whether they're religious or not. So it's really good.
So you're the national organizing manager there, and specifically the things that you do are like organizing, right? Like you get people together. What are some specific things you've done recently, maybe as an example?
Sure. So there are two other organizers here. So I oversee them, and basically we divide all of our chapters into 3 regions around the country. And I have the sort of the North Midwest and up to the Northeast. So like from Missouri east and north. So those are my campuses. And so I interact with them as often as possible, answer any questions, give them suggestions and encouragement. On the more national level, the new Bill Nye documentary just released, and we're working with PBS to organize. It's looking close to 20 or 30 screenings of that film on campuses, on our campuses. So, just coordinating all of that with student leaders from Oregon and Utah to Central Florida, helping them navigate. If some of them are really experienced, and they know exactly what to do, other leaders are newer, and just helping them navigate their student association how they can reserve space on their campus, how they can request funding, what kind of hoops they have to jump through to get the screening authorized, and how to publicize it, get the word out. So there's just all that kind of event planning type of stuff. We have a national conference every year, so we're organizing that. And we offer resources to our campuses. We have a speakers bureau. We have grants that we give out to student groups that are doing projects of various types. And so, yeah, we manage all of those interactions with our campus groups.
Yeah, cool. Well, and the thing I wanted to talk about next was the work that you're doing in Puerto Rico. So tell me kind of what you guys have been doing to help the folks in Puerto Rico and the affiliated groups there, and then how listeners can help.
Yeah, so I mean, the honest truth is we're not doing anything. The students in Puerto Rico are doing it. It's phenomenal. The one student leader there is also involved in his local sort of atheist organization and humanist. He's probably connected to.
That's Gerardo, right?
That's Gerardo.
Yeah, he was on my podcast. He's great.
Oh, he was.
Yeah, he's awesome.
He's fantastic. Yeah, that's so cool that you had him on the show. I'll have to look up that episode. So we were just my colleague Jason was on Skype with him today, just learning everything they're doing. I think the student club's Facebook page is available to the public. You could probably see it. There are photos there of the trucks full of bags of groceries, cleaning supplies. A lot of times in flooding situations, bleach is like a commodity, because there's just so much mold and,
wow.
Disgusting bacteria growing and all of that mess. And so, he still doesn't have electricity or running water where he lives. He's convinced they're not going to have electricity until February. Yeah, so then that's the 40 to 50, if not more, % of the island is under those circumstances. People don't have anything, I
can't imagine what Americans would be doing if this was Los Angeles or Dallas or New York. We'd be it'd be like the biggest crisis ever, and it's happening in Puerto Rico, so we're like, oh, well.
If the power's out for 24 hours in America, we lose our minds.
I know.
How am I going to make my espresso, man? Like
what? I have to shower in the cold? Or...
I know. Yeah, they're catching rainwater from the roof to drink. It's serious. People are in real jeopardy.
Wow. And you think about the hospitals and stuff. I don't even know how they're functioning if they don't. Maybe they've restored that power. I don't know.
I'm not an expert on exactly what's been restored and hasn't. I imagine there are some critical services that have been restored, but in the outlying areas, for sure, people are still without pretty much everything they need. Even, Jason said in his Skype conversation today, the internet at the university is super sketchy.
Wow.
Just, not very solid. So, we're doing our best just to cheer for them, and we're trying to get the word out about what they're up to. I'm not sure exactly what we're going to do, but if people wanted to contribute to that effort, I do know they need money and resources. If people wanted to donate to Secular Student Alliance in the name of our Puerto Rico chapter, we would be more than happy to not only pass that along in some form or fashion to them, but give an accounting back to the people who have donated.
Cool.
About what we're doing there.
And how do people donate?
Yeah, so the best way to donate, the easiest way, is just to go to our website, secularstudents.org, and go to the donate page, and you can make a recurring donation, you can make a one-time donation, and if anyone has any trouble with any of that, they can reach me at ryan.bell@secularstudents.org.
Okay, and they can specify what they want that to go to?
I'm gonna in the absence of our executive director at this very moment, I'm gonna go ahead and say yes. And if it turns out that some other thing is true, we'll definitely be in touch with the donor. But we want to do as much as we can to support them, and I'm quite confident that we can put those resources towards supplies, the kind of stuff that the students need that they're distributing by hand to people in their neighborhood.
Wow.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb and say yes, and we'll make sure it happens.
Cool. That's awesome. Well, you've just mentioned the website. I was going to ask you where people can go for more information, so I'll put the website in the show notes. And then for people thinking of supporting SSA in general, is it the same process?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Same process. The lion's share of our budget goes to support our student groups. We obviously have some overhead here in the office, but we spend about $40,000 on the annual conference for the students every year, giving them some travel grants and just putting on the conference. We give out scholarships. If people want to give specifically to scholarship fund, they can do that. And a lot of the money goes to project grants and speakers, travel expenses for speakers to go to campuses and speak to student groups. So there's a lot there. And if anybody wants to discuss that more, I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody.
And you said the best way to reach you was ryan.bell
at secularstudents.org.
All right.
Yeah,
perfect.
and the website is secularstudents.org. It's the website's a bit of a behemoth at the moment. We're about to launch a new one in the beginning of the year, but so we'll get the word out about that. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Secular Students, just at Secular Students, and our Facebook page. Similarly, you can find us at Secular Student Alliance. Just search for Secular Student Alliance on Facebook.
Awesome. Well, is there anything regarding your story or regarding Secular Student Alliance that you want to mention that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
If you know, well, I guess I would say this. If you have anyone listening, if you have a student in your life who's either in a high school, we've even entertained the possibility of a middle school. So if you have students in your life that, they might be students who are kind of slugging it out as maybe the only atheist that they know on campus, or it could be that they're at a very secular campus and just want to organize themselves with other secular students to do something good for the world. Ask them if they'd be interested in starting a club. It's not as hard as it sounds. It definitely, I'm not going to undersell it. It definitely takes some energy and some commitment, especially to do it well, and some stick-to-itiveness. You got to kind of stay with it for a little while.
Yeah.
But it's worth it. And I think, there's plenty of people I could put those students in touch with, other fellow students that would tell them about the experience. And so if you are a student listening, or if you are a parent of a student, or a cousin, or an uncle, or an aunt, or whoever, a friend of a student, that's kind of like, I don't know how to express my secular values, we can help you with that.
That's awesome. I actually have a 15-year-old high school sophomore son who is very, I think he's political minded, and I think he'd be interested in something like this. So I'm going to run it by him and see what he thinks. He's
That's
busy.
Great.
He's busy with choir and he's got lots of stuff going on, but I think he'll definitely be interested in it. So.
Yeah, and even if he's not interested in it in this very moment, maybe in his junior year he might be interested in it. Right. So I think it's, again, like what we were saying before. You plant a seed, and the time comes when it's right, and you never know.
Well, Ryan, thanks so much for carving time out of your day. I know you're a busy guy, and I'm just grateful that you sat down and we got to talk about not only your story, but the great things that are going on at the Secular Student Alliance. So thanks for doing the interview.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. Thank you for what you're doing. I mean, I think it's, these stories that you're telling and facilitating the telling of are really important for people that are on the journey and don't know where to turn. So thank you for what you're doing as well.
For sure. But yeah, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.